Welcome. We're so glad that you could join us today at Social Studies School Service. Today we have Dr. Jana Kirchner with us, and delighted to have Jana. She is one of our, you might say, kind of regulars on here. She does so much with us in the way of K-12 education and trainings, and we're just always very appreciative for her time and effort. Tonight, Jana's going to be talking to us about primary sources in the elementary classroom, so a very exciting topic. Jana, let me just go ahead and turn it over to you and let you get us started.
Okay, thanks, Pam. I'm really excited to be on with everyone tonight, and I'm going to hope that in the webinar tonight you'll see some strategies that you can immediately take back to your classrooms. As you log in, you'll see the chat feature over on the side, so please let us know where you're from, what you teach. There will be an opportunity in just a moment for you to talk about your experiences with primary sources. So if you would help us out and kind of give us some feedback on that, it helps me kind of know what to talk about as we do the webinar. So I'm excited you're with us. Let me just briefly give you a little information about me. So I have been in social studies my whole career. I'm a Kentucky educator and recently retired. I've been a high school teacher. I've been an instructional coach, an instructional supervisor for a school district, and taught at a university and taught social studies strategies and reading strategies, and now doing part-time work with schools on social studies strategies and working with social studies school service on a variety of their projects. So I'm excited to be with you, and we will get started with our webinar. Our tentative plan, let's see, my computer. There we go. Our tentative plan for the webinar tonight is to start us off talking about your own classroom practice, and feel free to be totally honest with that. You use primary sources, you don't use primary sources, all the answers are correct. There's no right or wrong. But depending on what you say with that, I want to show us some strategies that work for working with primary sources with young learners. And I'm going to say young learners and just kind of couch that in elementary right now. So whatever I say tonight or give an example of, as always, modify that for your grade level of students, for the content you teach. So lots of these are general strategies that will work in a variety of different ways. Also, feel free to ask questions or share your ideas. Pam's going to monitor the chat feature as I talk. And then please let us know your experience with these two. So the strategies we're going to talk about tonight, I lumped under 3 big ideas of how to teach with primary sources at elementary. And that is always begin with visuals if you can, model your thinking and encourage collaboration, and then use graphic organizers. So what we do at the end of this webinar will be a variety of strategies for each of those. So I'd love to get some feedback from you on this part and reflect on your own classroom practice. And I'm going to be quiet for a few minutes as we talk about these questions, but I want you to use the chat feature and respond to either or both of these questions, and think about what types of primary sources have you used with your students. And then, quite honestly, what can be challenging about using primary sources with elementary students? I'm going to intentionally not talk for a minute or two and let you think about those, and I'd appreciate some feedback. Okay, we have photos, artifacts, short journal entries. And one of the challenges we got is finding appropriate primary sources that are not too challenging for elementary readers. That's a great one. Sometimes they don't have enough analytical skills. Absolutely. To observe primary sources, you almost have to teach the skills first. That is a great response to that. They don't automatically come in at whatever grade level we teach them with a lot of background information or skills to be able to tackle that. So please keep adding to the chat. I'm going to keep going and we'll kind of add those in as we go. So let's look at some strategies and some big ideas of how to help students with primary sources, dealing with some of the challenges that a couple of you have commented on. So I want to ground this first in why it matters as far as the content of social studies. And nationally right now, the focus is around the C3 document, and that is College Career and Civic Life Framework. And if you notice, especially those of you elementary folks, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is a lot of the same standards that are in your reading, writing, and speaking and listening standards. So it's a great combination of how can we do social studies and reading, writing, and speaking all at the same time. But these are focused on 4 different dimensions. And I like this graphic because it puts it all together in one place. So dimension 1 is developing questions and planning inquiries. Dimension 2 is how do we use our disciplinary concepts? So how do we think like an economist or a geography? How would we look at a map? Like a geographer might look at a map and interpret information. Or how would we look at a history source like a historian might? What are we looking for? How are we trying to think about it? So that's our disciplinary concepts. Dimension 3 is evaluating sources and using evidence, and that language is right out of the reading standards that students can look at sources and analyze them and try to answer a question or solve a problem, make a claim. In the elementary years, it's called have an opinion with some support, and then along the way it changes to have an argument in the reading standards with evidence. And then how do we get them to communicate their ideas and their conclusions? And then the last part, I like this, is how do we get them to take informed actions? Our big goal for K-12 students as they graduate and go out into the world is that they are informed, responsible students who can read and be capable of civic action, civic life. So that's the national framework that all the states are at some level working on right now to try to adapt state standards to. So I think that's important as we set the groundwork for why we do what we do. Not only do we have this foundation in social studies, but there are so many parallels with the reading, writing, and speaking and listening standards that it's a natural match to think, how can we do this through the lens of social studies? So let's look at some ways to do that. And I called this slide thinking like a historian, but I could also have put there thinking like an economist or thinking like a geographer. Any of those disciplines in social studies would have been okay. For those young students, you almost need to teach them what is a historian? What's the role of a historian? What is history? What do we do to look at the past? How do we interpret the past? How do we figure out what's going on in these cultures that we read about or watch movies about? So I think part of it is changing our mindset as teachers, is that we look at a variety of text. And if you notice, I put text in quotes because in literacy world, text means anything students can get information from. So how do we look at all these different texts in social studies as a way of thinking about its evidence or its clues? So it could be a map and we're using a visual text, or it could be a newspaper headline, it could be, or a newspaper article, it could be written text, it could simply be a textbook, and that's okay. It could be artifacts that came up in our chat screen. It could be a photograph, and we try to look at that and make some meaning, or it could be a graph, and we know that in all the assessments, analyzing graphs and charts are skills that students are going to have to do in all content areas. So I think one of the ways we start to think about primary sources with elementary kids is we think of what are all the different types of text that we could put together in a unit to have students make meaning from. Those could be primary sources or something that was written or an image from the time period. It could be secondary sources, so something written about the time period, or especially with young learners, I think artifacts are powerful. And it's often challenging as teachers for us to find the real artifacts. So I think pictures of artifacts sometimes work just as well too. So if you will, for the rest of this webinar, think about, okay, how can we design lessons or units, either the day-to-day thing or our big unit planning, with the variety of experiences for students to interact with text all kinds of different text as we think about our content. And I'm going to show you some ways to do that. So the first thing I'll always say is begin with visuals. And I think that's good advice for little learners or high school learners, either one. A lot of times students don't have background information or the context of a time period or place or event. So a lot of times if we can start with a visual before we go to any written text, we can build some of that background knowledge for students. So I want to show you 4 of my favorite strategies, and these are not new. You can find all kinds of information on the internet, all sorts of way to modify these strategies. I think they just work really well getting students to analyze visuals and sort of focus on that inquiry that we talked about in our inquiry cycle with the C3. So one of those is a gallery walk, and I love gallery walk because I think it can be set up a lot of different ways around your classroom. The way I've typically done it and worked with teachers to do it is we put pictures or clues around the room and stations, either tape them to the wall or put them in little clue stations. If space is an issue, you can take a little piece of your hallway in your school building and have different clues placed down the hallway. But a gallery is a great way to expose students to a variety of visuals before we start to do the unit. So I'm going to use this one as an example, and here's our question. What was life like in a 17th century Powhatan village? Depending on the age of your student, you're probably going to need to explain what 17th century was. That's the 1600s. You might need to just give them a bit of context about the Powhatans and where they lived and just a little context to that, but you don't want to do too much because the whole focus of this is getting them to examine clues and try to come up with a hypothesis or an educated guess, if you want to use science language, about these people before they even read anything or watch a video or before you tell them. So I would set the question up for the class, what was life like in a 17th century village? And I have the source for this lesson if you're interested. And we're going to go around the room, and I just put a few slides. When I would do this with students, I would slow this down quite a bit. So you're going to examine some clues around the room with your group. Small groups always work better. And you're going to collect data on this clue sheet. And with young students, this works. I've done this with, I modified it for third. I've done it with fourth and fifth. Depending on the level of your students, you may have more clues, less clues. But I would suggest you have a variety of visuals, a variety of things for them to look at as they collect the information. This is just a simple hand Word document that's made into a clue sheet. And as I introduce this to students, I really make this dramatic that they're going to be detectives or archaeologists, and they're going to have to examine these clues and try to figure out what this culture was like. In this particular one, I set this up as a scenario. But so they're going to go around the room looking at these different clues. If you notice, these just happen to be photographs of a visit there, a family vacation visit, but you could find all kinds of pictures just like this online. You want to make sure you have a variety of types of visuals so that they can get something about maybe the government or what their houses look like or what their tools look like, or just so you want a variety of different pieces and parts so they can kind of get a comprehensive view of whatever the topic is. I say that, and then I say you could also do this with 2 pictures. And you show 2 pictures and you have students try to figure out what they can based on just those 2 pictures. So what they're going to do is they're going to go around the room and they're going to look at these different clues and try to collect information on their clue sheet with their team. And at the end, they're going to make a hypothesis to answer that mystery question. And that question is, what was it life like in a 17th century Powhatan village? So I would keep that on the board the whole time so it focuses their learning. So you saw some pictures. These are from the Jamestown Settlement website, and these are actual sketches from the 1600s. I would suggest to you also, if you have not had students analyze visuals at all, I would put up one of these first, or maybe just find a different one and model how to do this with students first. I would put up an example and say, look, tell me what you notice in this picture, and let them give you lots of examples. What do you think it tells us about the Powhatans? Where might we put that on our clue sheet? And really work through the process first before you let them go to the gallery walk. And I would say that advice to students of all ages. If this is a new skill for them, practice, practice, practice before you let them loose in the assignment. So you could pick any of those to model that with, and that'll work just fine. So notice we've had some pictures, we've had some sketches from the time period, so those will be primary sources. And then obviously it's hard for me to get 17th century real authentic artifacts. So with a quick trip to Hobby Lobby, I have examples of raffia that supposed to simulate the reeds in the area around the Chesapeake, and some blue beads, because archaeologists actually found blue beads as they excavated Jamestown. And so students could have something they could touch and feel. I have also used a visual with this as well. That's a visual of the Powhatan culture. So with young learners, they can collect this information and fill out their sheet without even doing any written words. With 5th grade students, I have added this text, and it's a primary source document. As a teacher, you are the boss of that classroom, and you know your students and you know their reading levels. So it might be that you need to excerpt pieces of this and not use the whole thing. That is absolutely fine to do. So what happens in this lesson is students try to figure out all these clues about the Powhatans, and then they read this primary source of somebody who actually visited, and they see if they were right. So you can imagine you can take that type of lesson all sorts of ways. Just some pictures to show you. These are 4th graders that are analyzing the reeds and the beads in the map with their clue sheet. It was Rockstar Day. You'll see that in the picture there. So what do you do next? You can do the hypothesis part a variety of ways. I have had students write a hypothesis statement with a visual that represented it. Like, what can we figure out from the Powhatans, and what's our evidence to support it? So as you have them present their hypotheses, however you choose to do that product, the key is that they support that with evidence from all the different texts that you have used. So the visuals, the artifacts, the map, the written text. So in that particular lesson, and that's about a 2-day lesson, they're having exposure to all those different texts. I've also done this, and I got this from an elementary teacher, so it's not original, that each table had a Play-Doh and a tub of Play-Doh, and they had to make them a museum exhibit on the Powhatans. But everything in the museum exhibit with their Play-Doh, if you can picture a table of Play-Doh museum exhibit, everything that they decided to put in their exhibit had to trace back to one of the clues or texts that they examined in the lesson. So I thought that was a creative way to do an assessment at the end and tie it all together. So again, they will have created all this knowledge. The inquiry piece of that is you haven't told them all this. You may have to clarify some content and guide the groups, but you haven't presented the information. They have figured it all out to answer that question. One of my other favorite strategies is I notice, I wonder, and there's a variety of ways to do this as well, but I notice, I wonder, this is a graphic organizer where you show a visual or a video clip, and on the left-hand side, they write down everything they notice about it. On the right-hand side, they write down questions they have about it. So if you don't want to use a handout, you could also have them just draw a line on a piece of paper, and it works the same way. And if you use this at the beginning of a lesson or unit, you can use the questions in their I wonder column to guide what you do next in the unit. So they're student-generated questions. Just show you some pictures that I've used with students and working with teachers of how this works with I notice, I wonder. This is a great one for the immigration unit. And what happens with it works every time when I use this with adults or I use this with students, either one. They will notice a lot of things about the clothes and the harbor and the Statue of Liberty, but their I wonder questions are almost always things like, where did they come from? Where are they going? Why are they going there? And what happens when they get there? Now, especially young kids will say that in different words, but if you look at almost everybody's state standards on immigration, those are the types of things that you would present to them anyway in learning targets. Reasons for immigration, causes and effects, where did they settle, what was life like when they got there. So students will have generated their own questions, and it honestly piques their interest a little bit too, because they think it's their ideas and you're planning your unit around answering these questions. It has to be an image that has a lot in it for that to work really well. You can also use photographs, and these are from the Library of Congress, but there are also several of these on Ellis Island's website, and that same thing works, that I notice, I wonder strategy. So then what do you do? So you have this list of things, this list of questions, and if you use I notice, I wonder, I would write some of the common questions on the board to guide their unit, that you can look for answers as they study, and they get so excited when they find an answer in the next few days to something they came up with as a question. But as far as teacher planning, what do you do next? You can do all kinds of things. You could have them look at other visual primary sources. This is just an example from the Library of Congress of what happens in Ellis Island as they went through the inspections. That would answer one of those questions. This is an example of a leveled reader from Nystrom, the Young Citizens Program, and this is an informational text from our reading standards. Why did immigrants come to America? That's a great way to assign that to students, or let them work with a partner and see if they can look for clues in their informational text. Or you might just want to work on some reading skills with a fiction work. And this is, if you're not familiar with this book, Pepe the Lamplighter has I won't tell you too much, but has a family that comes to New York, and lots of kids, and they're all trying to find jobs, and Pepe has something to do with being the lamplighter for the town, and that kid's book has great visuals of immigration. So you as a teacher could plan all these different experiences, or even show a video, all kinds of things to help look for answers to their questions. So I noticed, I wondered, great strategy. Another one that works great with kids, and honestly, we know as teachers, our skill that we're working with is analyzing visuals or analyzing primary sources. To the students, and even in high school, students sometimes they think this is just a fun game, which is kind of a win-win. So what you do is you take a photograph or a painting, you divide it into quadrants or thirds or halves, depending on what your photo is like, and you just do one quadrant at a time. So you cover them up and you open up one at a time, and you have students say, what do you notice in this particular quadrant? And it has them really zoom in on a particular part of the picture for specific details. And you just literally run your PowerPoint, go one quadrant at a time. And they get the whole image eventually, but they have practice looking for details in a photograph for all four of those quadrants. And sometimes I have even listed them on the board just to see how many things as a class they could generate from analyzing a visual. So this happens to be Mulberry Street in New York City around 1900. You can see there's a lot in this image, and it has to be, you have to use an image that has a lot in it. You don't want the top piece to be all sky or something like that. So you got to really find a good image. But all kinds of things will work with this. So what we might say, as we've described all these details, is we might, as a class, write down some observations we had. So what will we say life was like around 1900 based on just this photo? So you're practicing analyzing a photograph as their skill. Most reading series or leveled readers, or even just social studies texts will, at all the elementary levels, have some sort of concept of past and present, or then and now. So a good way to do that is to have photos. And this was just an online photo of somebody who had recreated this street corner from 1900. So putting two visuals up together is a great way to have students compare and contrast then and now, the past and the present. All kinds of things you could do with that. Or even if you're studying two different places, you could have a painting from two different places and use that same skill. A T-chart works great for that. And I think most of you are probably familiar with that. Cities then, cities now. What do we see in one photo? What do we see in the other? And then picture prediction, this works with reading and social studies. I've done this a variety of different ways. You can put one picture up and let them look at it. These particular pictures are not primary sources, but what they're doing is they're building some background knowledge for students before you go to the text that they're going to read, or you go to the video clip. So you could either print these out on a handout and have a handout at each table. You could have this up on the screen like I'm doing now. Any of those would work. And so you would have students look at the picture and talk to a partner Say, I want you to predict what this time period is going to be like, or what this story is going to be like, based only on the pictures. What would you predict? So I'd give them a few minutes to work and jot down some ideas with their partner, and then share those out and chart common ideas on the board. And then whatever happens next, whatever you do in class next, whether they watch a video or read a story or read something from a textbook, they are going to prove or disprove their predictions. And I've done this with even down to a first grade level. Like, here are our predictions we wrote on the board. We're going to put a check if we read something that says we got that right, and we're going to write it beside as evidence. So our skill is analyzing text and having evidence, but it works great with picture prediction. Great strategy to start with visuals. So what do you do next? This is a nice third grade textbook, Young Citizens. Once they'd made their predictions, this is an example of an informational text that could work great with your reading standards as well. So we see if we can prove or disprove our predictions based on our next text. So second big idea, and some of this we have talked about already, is always model your thinking and encourage collaboration. As young economists or geographers or readers and writers, we want students talking to each other about their ideas. So I would encourage you, if this is not something you typically do in your classroom, to always do think alouds. If you look that up online, there's so many examples of how to do it. But I think sometimes students think as teachers we magically know the answer, and when we look at a complex text or we look at a political cartoon or a painting, we just automatically get it. Well, those of us know that is not the case in any way. So make that thinking obvious to students. Slow down. Say, when I first look at this photograph, I look and see if there is a time period or a place, like our Mulberry Street example, or if I'm looking at this little paragraph of somebody's journal entry or diary entry, I first see if there's a person, an author, if there is a year. So automatically just get in the habit of thinking out loud with students, even if it's just modeling a few sentences of what you do when you get to complex text. So I also put model close reading and annotating text. If that's not a practice you use, once you have students who are readers, I highly encourage it, whether it's underlining or circling or putting your ideas in the margins. I've heard some elementary teachers that I've worked with say, I want to see the tracks of your thinking. I can't tell what your brain is thinking as you read or you look at this photograph, but if you put notes in the side, you're giving me tracks and I can follow your thinking. That was a great way to explain it. But model what you do when you get to a word you don't know. Do you circle it? Do you go back and reread? What if it's a complex paragraph? What do you do when you don't understand it? So always just make that a part of how your classroom runs, and that same idea applies to primary sources and visuals and all kinds of text. Encourage student collaboration. I think that's sort of a common sense idea, but think, pair, share, turn and talks, elbow partners, whatever you call that. Even if it's just a couple minutes, let them tackle that picture together, let them look at that clue together, or this little primary source paragraph has some really hard words. Turn to your partner and see if the two of you together can use your brains and figure out how to decode that passage. So always have students talking about whatever text they're using. And then I can't stress the importance of this enough, is always have a purpose. Why are we reading this text, or why are we looking at this picture? Are we trying to answer a question? Are we trying to look for clues to help us figure out a time period or a person's background? Or is this tied into figuring out our learning target today? Why are we looking at this as opposed to just being another activity? So carry that throughout everything you do. And then again, we've talked about some of these already, but use graphic organizers. We want students to be reading, writing, and thinking in social studies. So sometimes collecting their thoughts helps them to deal with those difficult texts and some of the things we've talked about that are challenges. Clue sheets, I showed you an example of one way to do that with the gallery walk with the Powhatans. We talked about a notice, I wonder chart, and we did that with immigration. The T-chart works for compare and contrast in any kind of way you use that skill. We did the cities then and now. And then if you have a little bit more complex primary sources, these last two ones are really good. So I want to show you those. So again, if you teach the early primaries, you may want to adapt this to your reading level of your students and their background knowledge. But I really like the SOAPs Think Sheet and the Library of Congress templates. So let me show you a couple of examples of what those look like. So in Kentucky, state history is 4th grade. So this is a 4th grade primary source. So SOAPs is a way of looking at primary sources in an organized way with an acronym that works in almost every situation. So teachers that I know that use this and use this well have this on their wall as a poster, and the students know if they get a source that's new, they say, are we supposed to SOAP this? They even sort of make it a verb. So this particular one, Kentucky was a border state in the Civil War, and that's part of the 4th grade standards in our state. So this is a broadside, and one of the standards is specifically why did Kentucky have a critical role, something to that effect in the Civil War. So this was a great example of how to use SOAP. So what you would do, you might want to start with the modeling and think aloud. Like if I use this with students, I would automatically say, hey, this one is an easy one with a date because we know automatically when it is and we know the author of it because this particular broadside tells us. So how could we use what we can see together as a class? Where would that fit on our SOAPs? So is it subject? Is it occasion? Is it audience, purpose, or speaker? And I would let us work through that as a class. Then I might put them in small groups and say, let's see what you can figure out for the rest of the SOAPs. There are going to be some difficult words or places that you might not know what they are, so circle those or write those down, and just get students that experience of dealing with a primary source. You have to kind of tell them first what a broadside is. That's not a word they're used to, but this was a really good one for targeting that social studies standard for state history. If you look online, there are a variety of templates for how to do SOAPs, or sometimes you'll see it just as SOAP without that last S. This is one from the National Archives. This is the top half of the document, and you could use this. You can find this online. You can use all these parts and all the questions, or if that's just too many words for your students, it's also okay just to pick and choose and make your own SOAP Think sheet. So if you notice, in case students need some prompting, it gives them some questions like, what's the topic for subject? What do we think the author thought was important? For our broadside, it was sort of easy for students to pick that one out because the letters were so big and the font was so big on that broadside. But occasion, audience, what kind of document is it? And then purpose and speaker. Again, you can shorten these to meet the needs of your class and your students and make your own SOAP sheet. It's a really cute little acrostic for helping students learn how to tackle written primary sources. Other favorites are Library of Congress templates, and you can search for these on the Library of Congress site, and I kind of showed you the search process here. But if you just type in Library of Congress Teachers Guides or Library of Congress Analysis Tools, it will pop up this page, and if you notice, they give you a variety of types of primary sources. So these are downloadable as a PDF, or they have it where you can also do it online if you want to with students where they type in the boxes. But if you notice just from my screenshot, sorry about that, they have different templates for different types of primary sources. So there's one analyzing maps, analyzing motion pictures, analyzing political cartoons, analyzing sheet music, or there's just a general one that's an analyzing primary sources in general. So let me show you what they look like. They all look like this particular template. I just put the analyzing maps as my screenshot in this one. But the reason I like them so much is because they follow a pattern that matches our inquiry cycle from the C3 document. And if you notice, they will all have observe, reflect, and question. They have prompting question for students. These never mean that you want students to answer all these questions. They're just helping them think if they know where to get started. So if we were looking at a map, a historical map or a modern map, first you would have students talk about what they observe. So you get a very literal description. And then reflect is, what do you think it means? What's that telling us? and some prompting questions if they need it. And then question, and this is a piece I love because of the inquiry. So what do we wonder about? What do we not know from this source? And then on the bottom, how could we find out the information? How could we find out what we need to know? That whole structure of analyze the primary source goes through all that inquiry cycle. So it could be we need to look up something, we need to research, we need to read, we need to watch a video. So using that and using that with students can help kind of guide your lessons and units too. So again, they're on all types of different primary sources. For instance, this is a 5th grade student in Kentucky, is John Smith, and John Smith's map, it works great with that analyzing maps template because there's so much in this map that students first off can observe, and then they can reflect. What do you think it tells us about Virginia and the Powhatans? And then what do we not know? In that third column is questions, and then how could we find out that information? So that template works great with a historical source. Or you could also use, I just got a modern map, a modern political map of Asia from the Young Citizens 2nd grade textbook. It would also work with that. What do we observe about this? And you can use the map and the legend, and what do we think it tells us about Asia? And then what do we wonder about? And then how could we find out some more information? So those templates work for historical sources or even modern ones as well. And there is a general one, and I put the passage up on the side, and you can kind of read that if you want. This is a diary entry from the Wrights, the day they flew the airplane. And this is right out of a textbook, and you can find this quote online, but there is a primary source analysis tool that's just real general. Once your students get in the habit of using it, you could give them a little piece of text, and what do they see? Well, they could see that it's a certain year. They could see that it's written by Orville Wright. It's 1903. It's December 17th. It looks like it's a quote by him. So they could do that, observe, reflect. What do they want to know about that? It works for quotes, or it also works for visuals. Where do you go next? When they say we need more information, they can do research on their own. You can show them a visual. This is just an example from a 3rd grade textbook with Young Citizens again, and I pulled this quote right out of that. So that particular quote is a pretty manageable text, I think, especially for older elementary students. So that template works great with that. So a lot of talking by me. Questions or comments or ideas about how you might use primary sources or some of these strategies? Feel free to use the chat feature.
Hey, if you have any questions or comments, please use the chat feature there and let Jana know your questions or comments. I love it. I had a 1st grade teacher, Jana, who was using some primary source photographs with her students, and she was using some from about the early 1960s, and they were in black and white. The student said, "Oh, we didn't know that even the trees were black and white back then. There wasn't any color anywhere."
Oh,
So
that's cute.
like, okay, that's pretty cute. So their context for understanding primary sources sometimes is not necessarily where we think it is, or we don't think to tell them something like that in advance. Let's see if we got
That's
anything over
true.
here.
Well, and while we're waiting, like a couple of 1st grade teachers that I worked with a few weeks ago said they even have to model for students on the questioning columns of whatever they use. What is a question? Because for
Wow.
especially little bitty learners, they want to tell you everything they know, and
Uh-huh.
sometimes it's a lot of statements and they forget. So they put question stems on the board, like who is,
Mm.
what is, why is, and a question mark. So they review what is the structure of a question. It's something that starts with these words and it ends with a question mark. And I thought that was a great way to teach that skill too for those really young learners.
Absolutely. And over in your chat, Jana, you do have a comment or question rather
Um,
from Steve.
yeah, so hi Jesse. Yes, I have worked with IDM some with C3 teachers. They have a lot of great resources If you are not familiar with that, it's an inquiry design module where teachers across the country are writing lessons and writing units on the inquiry cycle. So you can search by grade level, you can search by content area. The state standards differ a little bit from state to state, but it's a great resource, especially for older learners. I'm not sure if it goes down to lower elementary or not. I haven't seen many of those at that level, but I know that is something that's growing, and people are constantly adding to it. Thank you for pointing that out.